Those of you that are technology enthusiasts may remember from the 1990s, from the first internet technology boom, Sun Microsystems, who, as their adverts used to say, put the dot in .com. The chief executive of Sun Microsystems, Scott McNealy, was asked at a press conference in 1999 about the privacy impact of some new technology that they were releasing, and he famously replied, "You have zero privacy anyway, get over it." What I want to address in my lecture this evening, first of all, was he right? Then or now, as Professor Hamilton said, obviously the internet is much more pervasive and woven into a far larger number of people's day-to-day lives 15 years on. If he was right then or now, what can a society that values privacy, that thinks it remains a key human right and a key societal value, do about that? Should we just hold our hands up and give up? I will argue no. This is my answer in 3 parts. I'll say a bit more about some of those challenges to privacy that are brought both by the continuing technological development that we see with the internet and related technologies like smartphones, but also, just as importantly, some of the market structures that have built up around those technologies, and which I would argue are a part of the challenge that they bring to privacy, and also to think a little bit about where problems have come even from authorized access within organizations to some of the personal data collections that have been built up in the last decade. Then I'll go on to talk about some of our research at Oxford in this area, particularly looking at some examples of how you can build privacy into new technologies rather than just waiting for things to go wrong and try to clean up after the mess develops. And lastly, I will try to draw out some broader lessons about the ways that society can shape new technologies for the public good, whether that's privacy or whether that's other core public values. So first of all, the very rapid development of computing over the last 70 years has played a key part in the internet and the technologies you're all using day to day. This is a bomb from the Second World War. This is a US version, but the UK developed first, a machine that was focused just purely on one task, which was helping decrypt the top secret messages between the members of the German High Command, encrypted using their famous Enigma cipher. So that was a very basic, very early computer. That developed after the war, not least through the research of people like Alan Turing into the general purpose programmable computers that we are all using today. This was a room-sized one, never mind a broom-sized cupboard. This was ENIAC. This was the first programmable, widely used computer. Obviously, the size, the expense, the fact it needed staff permanently to be keeping it humming along meant that it was something that only large governments and businesses could use. Of course, that shrank, increased in capability very quickly to the mini computers that businesses were using in the late 60s and 70s, and then onto people's desktops. That's a BBC B computer from the 1980s. If you know the Raspberry Pi today, you could say that's the sort of grandfather or great-grandfather of the Raspberry Pi. That was one of the first computers that I programmed when I was at first school. And of course, you now have in your pockets, I'm sure, most of you, the smartphones that are much more powerful than the BBC Bs or the ENIACs or the bombs. And coming very soon, I wonder if anyone in the audience already even has, or maybe has brought tonight, their Google Glass. This is a wave of technology that I think over the next couple of years will really become mainstream, the idea of the Internet of Things or wearable technology where computers, sensors, and even motors and actuators migrate into all kinds of everyday objects, not just glasses. I've seen biometric headphones recently, fake false teeth that will measure your activity and help you plan your fitness regime. So computers will, today they're rather obvious. You tend to sit and interact with them at a screen or at least on your smartphone. They will disappear into the environment. They will be everywhere without you even realizing. All of this development are examples of actually something that was predicted in the very early 1960s by Gordon Moore, who was the founder of Intel Corporation, the father of the modern microprocessor. And you can see a sketch on the left from one of his notepads where he predicted, after just 2 or 3 years of designing very early microprocessors, the way that he could see that those developing over time. And what he predicted, what's become known as Moore's law, is that the number of components you can get on a chip of a given size will roughly double every 2 years. And roughly speaking, that translates into computing capability and power doubling every 2 years. Of course, over time, over 4 decades, over 5 decades, that translates into a very dramatic increase indeed in computing capability. This is, on the right, this is a graph from Google Research showing a large number of microprocessors from 1971 to 2011, and you can see that they follow very closely that doubling every 2 years. It's a log scale, so you can see in the values on the y-axis how that translates over time from a number in the low thousands into the 2.6, the millions and millions. Things keep jumping up and up. So that's computing capability. Similarly, the bandwidth that's available, so the amount of data that you can send down what were largely copper telephone cables in the early days of the internet, now fiber optic cables, satellite links, Wi-Fi, microwave, all the various ways that you can send data across networks, including the internet. That bandwidth capability has been doubling at a pace similar to the advance of computing capability, and similarly with storage, the amount of data that you can store on hard disks of a given physical size, advancing roughly at the same doubling every 2 years. And you'll know that even if you've gone from say a laptop 10 years ago to your MP3 player today, just how much more data you can get in your pocket now than even a few years ago you would be thinking about storing on a smartphone. So computing systems have this much greater capacity to process data, to store it, and to share it. And if that data relates to people, if it's personal data, of course, that is where you start to get questions about the impact on privacy of all of this. Alongside those technical developments, I mentioned market structures and market failure. Why is it that if some people would like privacy built into online services and systems, that often it's not quite as easy to get that privacy as they might want? Well, actually, there's a lot of very interesting behavioral economics research being done in the last decade trying to explain what's sometimes called this privacy paradox, that people say privacy is important to them, and yet they act in ways that would make you think was not bearing out that claim. So the first big way in which people find it difficult to execute their privacy preferences, if you like, is that often there's a big asymmetry between the people collecting the data, the organizations collecting the data, and the people that the data is about. Those organizations have a much better idea often about what data they're collecting, what it can be used for, how it might affect the individuals concerned, than the people who are the data subjects, as they are called in data protection law. That's particularly true of the kinds of wearable technologies I was telling you about earlier. I mean, you might not realize even with your smartphone that those have, most of them, location systems built in using GPS satellites, but also using the Wi-Fi and the mobile phone networks that the phone can detect at any given time to know where you are. Certainly iPhones, I know, keep records of that. They'll even tell you places where you've spent a lot of time. That might not be information you would necessarily want to share with everyone in your life. Privacy policies. Who in the audience has read a privacy policy on a website from start to finish? There are a few, a small number. Keep your hands up if you understood all of the legal consequences of it. Yes. So very few of those people in the world indeed. Privacy policies generally, often they're thousands, if not tens of thousands of words. One study a couple of years ago looked at how long it would take the average reader to work through the privacy policies of the most popular websites of the time. They reckoned at least 10 minutes. They also found that the average user was visiting about 120 different websites a year. Put those together, that's 20 hours a year of reading privacy policies. There are not many internet users that are doing that. Secondly, an interesting thing about privacy and about disclosure decisions, so moments at which people are asked, whether it's by a social networking website or all kinds of other technologies, are you willing to, at this moment, disclose this bit of information about yourself to me? Here's the benefit. Perhaps you can show off your party photos to your university friends, all sorts of other reasons that people polish their reputations online, do other kinds of things with their personal data that have an immediate payoff, if you like, but there may be perhaps a relatively low probability in the long term of a negative consequence. Perhaps sharing those first-year undergraduate photos might cause difficulties at interview panels 3 or 4 years later when you're applying for jobs. Perhaps sharing the data from your Fitbit device about your various biological readings as you were jogging will impress your running club friends today, but in 10 years' time might be seen by insurance companies, health insurers in particular, to suggest that there's a risk you might suffer from heart disease later in your life. The thing that's often particularly difficult for people to understand in terms of long-term costs of disclosure of information is when these different bits of data are put together, often they can be revealing of all sorts of things that might not be obvious to you. So even just taking those two examples of the party photos and the enthusiastic runner, maybe it suggests that you're an impulsive, high-risk taker, which might be something that would encourage some employers, but certainly would discourage others, might make it more difficult for you to get some kinds of financial products. People in general, not just about privacy, are very bad at making these immediate benefit versus deferred uncertain cost decisions. It's not just children that want the sweets now and don't worry about the consequences. Lastly, more traditional economics, you'll recognize this just looking at search engines, social networking sites, all sorts of other market sectors online. They are highly concentrated. So in almost all of the European Union member states, Google has 90 to 95% plus of the search engine market. In the United States, 71% of internet users use Facebook. And so people that perhaps would like to seek out sites and services that have different privacy policies may not actually have realistic alternatives. There might not be sites that do anything like as good a job as the market leaders. That's one reason that they're market leaders. And that's particularly true of social networking sites, because even if you don't like the privacy policy of a certain site and want to leave, all your friends are likely still to be there. And if the whole purpose of the service is to share content, to share status updates, photos, and so on, you're going to feel pretty lonely on this service over here, away from all of your friends. So again, limiting competition and limiting, therefore, production of privacy through the marketplace if it's something that consumers are interested in. Then you have a couple of specific areas I mentioned relating to authorized access to personal data in some senses, not in others. So one that The Guardian has done a lot of reporting on over the last 7 or 8 years is to do with not just external hacking into systems, but actually what's called blagging, paying the people inside businesses, inside telephone companies, inside the Drivers and Vehicles Licensing Association, paying police officers with access to the National Criminal Records databases to get that data. And this price list, you can see, resulted from just one raid by the Information Commissioner's Office. That's the body responsible in the UK for enforcing data protection law. Just one private investigator had a price list. Here it is. You can see some of the prices that the PI was paying to the corrupt insiders, the staff inside these organizations that had authorized access to the data. Of course, they weren't authorized to sell it to private investigators. And then you can see on the right the price that the PI was charging to media organizations, to financial services institutions in the City of London and elsewhere, to local councils. The client list was quite extensive, and you can see this was a pretty profitable business. And actually, this investigation is still ongoing. It's not just the ICO that is involved. They had to bring in what's now the National Crime Agency, and the Home Affairs Select Committee has been following these investigations with interest also. So this is one problem with the idea that it's fine for organizations to collect lots and lots of data so long as they secure their computer systems and stop hackers breaking in. You still have the problem of the insider that might have access to that data. Of course, the other thing, The Guardian and The Washington Post and New York Times and other media organizations have extensively reported since last June the Edward Snowden revelations. And I think what's surprising about these is not, as lots of people have said, spy who knew, but it's the vast scale on which these programs that the US National Security Agency, that GCHQ, that their equivalent agencies in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and of course many other countries in the world. It's not only the US and the UK that are doing this, we just know a lot more about what they're doing because of Edward Snowden. This was one of the first slides that was leaked by Snowden. It's actually an introduction to the systems to new NSA analysts that want access to this data, and it's saying, as you can see, upstream is grabbing large quantities of data off the fiber cables, the satellite links, and so on, and related programs that are carrying a huge amount of internet data. So every time you're don't just think email, think all of the interactions that you have online with websites, particularly if they're in the US, is potentially flowing through these cables and into the databases of NSA and GCHQ. Also Prism, which is what NSA codenamed their system, where they could go to American companies and say, under American law, the FISA Amendments Act, Section 702 is what the title of the slide is about. NSA can go to those companies and say, we want access to the following data on a large scale. So on the level of 250 million accesses a year, roughly, is Prism, although upstream dwarfs that even, that there are billions of transactions a day apparently being ingested, as the NSA call it, into their systems. It's not, of course, that NSA or GCHQ have tens of millions of staff sitting reading through everyone's emails. They're doing analysis and analytics and peering further into that data from there. So those are the challenges that technology, that market structure, that alternative businesses or alternative business models, you might say, getting access to people's personal data stored online. How do we design technologies that protect privacy, that perhaps make some of that bulk access, that large-scale access, a bit more difficult? So let me say a little bit about the principles that computer scientists have been developing in how to build those privacy-protective technologies, and then give you a couple of examples from our research at Oxford, and how you do that in concrete systems, targeted advertising, related work by colleagues on smart meters and congestion charging, and then some work we've done on privacy-friendly robots, before I think more about broader lessons. So this in one slide is the technologist's guide to building privacy-friendly technologies. And actually the principles as such are not so complicated. So the most important one is what data protection lawyers call data minimization. That says you should only collect data about people that you need to provide the service that they've asked you to provide. You might think that's very obvious. Actually, the way that technologists often work is, well, if it's very easy and cheap to collect lots of data and to keep it for a very long time, well, why not do that? You might find ways later of making money out of that data. So understandable reaction of technologists, but I think it's really key, this idea that no, you limit the data you collect in the first place, as well as securing it, so having the firewalls and so on to try to keep out the hackers. Decentralize the data. Don't hold it in big central databases, because those are very attractive targets both for hackers and for people inside the system, and indeed for the operators of the system to find other purposes for the data. Spread it out through a large-scale network. So an example of that would be in the National Health Service. Don't build big central NHS-managed records of tens of millions of people's medical history, have GPs and hospitals manage the data, linked up, of course, so that when you're going between GP, hospital, and so on, they can transfer that data as necessary, but not putting it in big central pots. Limit the access, even to your authorized staff, your insiders. Of course, that's one thing NSA has learned from Edward Snowden. And enforce those limits using encryption. So if, for example, one of your staff has put some company data on their laptop or on a USB stick or on a DVD or CD that they've sent through the post, as we remember from 2007 in the UK, the loss of 25 million people's child benefit records. If that data is encrypted, it means that anyone that gets a hold of that storage media can't access it, can't make any use of it, as long as the encryption is implemented competently. So these principles mean you protect not just against the hackers, the people outside, but you protect against the corrupt insiders. Also, you limit what's called function creep. You make it more difficult for the organization to decide, I want to do lots of new, unrelated things with this personal data I've gathered. The other important aspect of designing for privacy is that as far as possible, you want your users to understand what data you're collecting about them, how you're going to use it. Ideally, that they will explicitly consent to that collection and use. That can be trickier than it sounds, especially on a smartphone or other kind of device with small screen. This is an example from some colleagues' research at the Open University, where they were trying to help people understand who they were sharing their location with. So you can see here, you as a user might be willing to always share your location with certain people, like close family members, but perhaps less close family, friends, colleagues. You might in some circumstances be willing to do that, but you perhaps don't want, especially your colleagues, to be asking constantly and building up quite a detailed picture of your movements. So this user interface, the idea was you can easily see this person's asking for permission to see your location today, but they also asked last week and the week before, and this is where they saw you. This is the pattern. They're already building up over time of what you're doing. So let me give you a concrete example of those principles in action. This is some targeted advertising research that I did with Hamid Haddadi from Queen Mary, who's in the audience, and some other colleagues. We called MobiAd. Targeted advertising underpins the business models of most of the internet. If you think about all of those free services that you're using, the search engines, the social networking sites, and so on, they're making money through gathering data about you and your use of the service and then showing you targeted adverts based on that. So it's really important for the economy of the internet. If you want to introduce privacy online, in a way, this is the biggest single issue you have to face. You have to find ways to enable that business model to keep working, but to, rather than, as we have today, companies that you've heard of, like Google and Facebook, but also many companies you have not, lots of large advertising networks tracking your online activities, building up detailed profiles of you. So WPP, the advertising agency, has already built up profiles about 500 million internet users around the world. That's just one of many examples. Many websites you go to, there will be dozens, if not hundreds, of advertising networks tracking your activities. Can we do this research asked, in a way that gives the user more control of that data about them? So what we did was develop software that would run on your phone, that would monitor your activities, so it would know what you were interested in, what kinds of websites you were doing, what kinds of visiting, what kinds of locations you were in. It could show you adverts based on that information, but the profile, importantly, stayed under your direct control on your smartphone, rather than being held by organizations who knows where in the world. And it works particularly efficiently for location-targeted adverts. Shops are very keen to be able to, as you walk past, send you vouchers, for example, if they think you might be interested in their products. Using the way that mobile phone networks and Wi-Fi networks work, that they can broadcast data like adverts just as efficiently, say, to everyone in this room in one go as to one person at a time. That means you can do these location-targeted adverts very efficiently with the system that we designed. Also, it's important that if you show people adverts and they click on them, they show interest, you have to make sure the advertising network knows that's happened, because then they will charge the advertiser. Usually it's a cost per click business model. So we also developed a system that would let the software on your phone send an anonymous report back to the ad provider. So they know that someone has clicked on this advert, but they don't know that it's you. So they can't link the subject of the advert back to your profile. This kind of approach, where you use a smartphone or another device that you control to do the profiling, to store the data and only send limited amounts of data then back to other parties, is useful in lots of other ways. I'll just give you a couple of examples. One is smart meters. All of the EU member states within this decade are trying to get 80% plus of households to install smart electricity meters that will gather 15-minute readings, usually, of your electricity consumption. That can reveal a lot about your day-to-day life, the time you're getting up and going to bed, how many people are in the house, when they're taking showers, when they're using different kinds of appliances, even actually which TV channels they're watching. You can get that far into people's lives. So this is a system developed by University College London colleagues that would let you keep all that data on your smart meter in your house and only send very limited summaries of it back to your electricity company so that they could bill you, but not find out anything else about what you're doing. A second example, congestion charging, of course, you all know about in London. London actually has almost the least privacy-friendly kind of congestion charging system you could design. You put cameras around the border, you send cars around inside, you recognize number plates, so you have a complete map of all of the car movements during the entire life of the congestion charging scheme. This scheme by colleagues at Leuven University in Belgium did the opposite. Again, it relies on an onboard unit in your car to collect that data, to reveal very limited amounts of the data back to the congestion charging authority to pay your bills, but not over time to be giving a congestion charging authority a detailed picture of your car movements over months or years. So that's how you design for privacy, and that brings you on very naturally to the question, well, first of all, how do you encourage technology companies and people buying technology to implement some of those design principles I was telling you about, but also broader issues about how societies can shape technology development for the public good, whether that's privacy, whether that's freedom of expression, other values of the public good in your local society. Of course, that raises the question, who defines that public good? How does that link to some of the government surveillance programs Edward Snowden has revealed? I'll talk a little bit about some EU legislation that tries to do what I'm talking about. And then lastly, come back to this question of encouraging more competition. So a free market complement, if you like, to the more state regulatory issue. One way that you could think about defining the public good is to say, well, what kinds of things do citizens in democracies show high levels of concern with over very long periods of time? So the European Commission does regular surveys across the EU member states, asking them about a range of social issues, one of which is data privacy. You can see in most of the states there, including the United Kingdom in the bottom right, pretty sustained public concern over privacy over decades. So you can see with the UK going back to 1991 when this data series started, between 76 and 81% of people saying they are concerned about data privacy. So that's one straightforward way that, of course, politicians in a democracy are concerned when 80% of their voters say they care about something like privacy. I think a more sort of fundamental way of approaching that question would be to look at, in countries that have constitutions, what those constitutions say, or at least in countries like the UK that do not, are they parties to international conventions like the European Convention on Human Rights, which state some of these foundational societal values. So the ECHR on the left there, of course there is the Article 8 right to privacy that gets so much often negative coverage in the UK media because of its link to family life and immigration, but that says everyone has the right to respect for your private and family life, home and correspondence, of course, including email. but also related rights that privacy underpins. So the right to freedom of thought, to freedom of expression, to freedom of assembly and association. Privacy underpins those in some subtle ways. So do you really have the right to say what you want to say if you're always concerned that somebody might be listening in, and in what you say is controversial, that might have a negative impact on you later in your life? Similarly, if you want to associate with people that are not so popular, particularly in states that are not quite as, in general, democratic and peaceful as the United Kingdom is. I think actually people don't usually so much talk about freedom of thought in this context, but I think when you have the scale of monitoring of people's online activities that we do, both from the public sector and the private sector, I think that raises interesting questions. How far do you even have the ability to explore new ideas if you're concerned that every time you visit a website on a controversial subject, that fact might be noted? The US Constitution, of course, has its very famous First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech and also freedom of assembly, but also the Fourth Amendment, which talks about the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. If you know the constitutional history of that was a very direct response to the UK's tyrannical behaviour, the general warrants that King George had issued that allowed broad searches of the colonists' homes rather than targeted searches. And of course, that issue has come right back to the forefront in US legal cases. There have been 2 federal district courts in the US now that have ruled on the constitutionality of some of the programs revealed by Snowden. Slightly confusingly, they've said the opposite things. The federal district court in Washington said, particularly the access by NSA to large databases of all of the telephone calls taking place in the US is clearly unconstitutional because of the Fourth Amendment, whereas the New York District Court said, no, it's not. Therefore, there will be appeals, and I strongly suspect the Supreme Court will be asked to rule on that in the next year or two. In Europe, in the UK, a number of campaign groups have taken cases to the Investigatory Powers Tribunal about the GCHQ programs, but also campaign groups. The campaign groups Big Brother Watch, the Open Rights Group, and English Pen have taken a case directly to the European Court of Human Rights, and I've written an expert witness statement for them explaining some of the technology and how some of these things some of the GCHQ programs are interacting with UK law and whether that is or is not compatible with the European Convention. And I think that large-scale versus targeted surveillance issue is very important, and it links directly to this data minimization principle I was describing. And interestingly, even some people who are not civil libertarians, who are not the ACLU or other campaign groups, are coming round to that perspective. So President Obama set up an independent review panel on intelligence and communications technologies, which included a former acting director of the CIA. And I won't read the full quote out there, but you can see in their report, they said, as much as it might be reassuring for governments and for some voters to think, well, if only the government had access to everything, but they only used it under very specific circumstances, you can see that they say, no, that would have too big an impact on quality of life and individual freedom, and that the US government should explore software that would let NSA do targeted information acquisition rather than bulk data collection. So data minimization, even for intelligence agencies, interesting. And the Deputy Prime Minister just 2 weeks ago similarly said, we can't just assume that collecting large amounts of data, as long as we have strict rules about how it's used, adequately protects privacy. He said, no, you have to also think about how proportionate is the collection of data in the first place. So I think those are really key issues going forward. Away from government, how do you persuade particularly the private sector to be taking account of these privacy by design principles in their new technologies? This is an attempt by the European Union to do just that with what the GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. Article 23 of that regulation, again, I won't read through all the quotes, but it says that businesses that are going to be collecting lots of personal data with new technologies have to as far as possible, make sure those technologies are built in privacy protective ways. So following the kinds of principles that I was describing. That regulation was agreed just last week by the European Parliament, and now it's waiting for the member states in the Council of Ministers to agree on a final text. Lastly, I mentioned this competition aspect. This is something I worked with a colleague from Sussex University, Chris Marsden, a book we published last year called Regulating Code, where we explored, amongst other things, this potential interoperability requirement as a way to encourage competition amongst services like social networking sites, where you have these strong network effects, as economists call them, that you want to be where your friends are. Just like the telephone, we said, well, telecom regulators have been aware of that issue for many years, and in various ways, telephone networks are required to interconnect their networks. So you don't have to be on the same landline telecom company network to call your friend or your family. You can know that you can seamlessly get a hold of them, whichever network they're on. So in that book, Chris and I explored that as a possibility for dominant social networking services. We think that would be an interesting model to consider further. So having said all of that, I think clearly technology developments are having a significant social impact on privacy. I hope I've given you at least some ideas about how societies, if they wish, can try to shape technical development and to shape the values that are embedded in technologies. There are lots of privacy protective technologies that have been developed for all sorts of applications. I wouldn't want to bore you, of course. I could have talked for hours about all of the different ways you could use these principles. The big question now is, how do we persuade government agencies and companies to take them up? Because it's not always in the private interest of those parties to do that. And clearly also, these are questions not just for computer scientists, not just for technologists. You need lawyers to be thinking about legal frameworks, economists thinking about market design, sociologists and psychologists looking at how people use and interact with technology. So that's on the academic side. This Internet Science project that the logo comes from is a network that Oxford and 40 other European universities are partnering on, funded by the European Commission, to try to take this holistic approach to how the internet develops over the next 10, 20, 30 years. But also, this is the approach that my department at Oxford, the Oxford Internet Institute, very much takes. My colleagues come from all these disciplines and more, and we, I think, are all convinced that this is something that's very important for addressing all kinds of social impact of the internet questions, not just privacy. And of course, last but certainly not least, these are questions very much for citizens and for their representatives in parliaments. These are things we shouldn't just be sitting back and saying to the computer scientists and to the technology companies, go ahead, design these technologies completely as you like. We'll leave things completely up to the marketplace, even if it has the impact that Scott McNealy was claiming in 1999. So if you want to follow up any of those, these are the studies that I quoted, but I hope you found that interesting, and I'm looking forward to discussing these issues with our panel from industry and from Parliament and from the media. Thank you.